It all started on a bright, crisp Monday morning, the kind that made you feel anything was possible. 10-year-old Alana Thompson had just stepped into her school's gymnasium, her face glowing with excitement. She'd been dreaming of this day for weeks, the day the school dance auditions were being held. For Alana, dancing was more than just moving to music. It was her way of expressing herself, of finding joy even in tough moments. Little did she know this day would change everything, not just for her, but for everyone around her. Alana's mother, Denise, had braided her hair the night before, and the vibrant pink ribbon tied at the end of her ponytail bounced with every step she took. She wore her favorite pair of sneakers, slightly scuffed from hours of practicing in the living room. Despite her nerves, she couldn't stop smiling. The other kids were already warming up, stretching and chatting in small groups, and the upbeat music playing over the gym speakers filled the air with energy. But behind the judges' table sat Mrs. Randall, the head of the dance program. Her expression was as sharp as her pencil skirt, and her piercing eyes scanned the room with what felt like disapproval. Mrs. Randall had a reputation for being strict, but few knew just how deep her biases ran. For years, whispers among parents hinted at her favoritism. She seemed to gravitate toward a certain type of student, often leaving others feeling overlooked or discouraged. Today, those whispers would become a storm. When Alana's turn came, she stepped into the center of the gym with her head held high. She took a deep breath and glanced toward the bleachers, where her mom was sitting, giving her an encouraging thumbs up. As the music started, Alana poured her heart into the routine she had spent weeks perfecting. Her movements were fluid, her rhythm flawless, and for a few moments, it was as if the world had melted away. But as soon as the music stopped, the room filled with an eerie silence. Mrs. Randall lowered her clipboard and gave Alana a look that felt like ice water being poured over her dreams. "That was something," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But honestly, Alana, maybe dance isn't the right fit for you. You need to work on your physicality, your size, for instance. Dance requires a certain standard." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and the other kids exchanged uncomfortable glances. Alana froze, the sting of the comment hitting her harder than she ever imagined. For a moment, she felt like shrinking into herself, like maybe Mrs. Randall was right. Maybe she didn't belong here. But the thing about Alana was, she wasn't the type to give up. Her mom had always told her, "Don't let anyone dim your light." So instead of crying, instead of walking away, she stood tall and looked Mrs. Randall straight in the eye. "What's wrong with my size?" she asked, her voice steady despite the lump forming in her throat. "I can dance just as well as anyone else." Mrs. Randall smirked, clearly taken aback by Alana's boldness. "Confidence is one thing," she replied, "but reality is another. I'm just being honest with you. It's for your own good." The room felt like it was holding its breath. Alana glanced at her mom again, who was now standing, her face a mixture of anger and pride. Denise had always taught her daughter to stand up for herself, and in that moment, Alana decided she wasn't going to let Mrs. Randall, or anyone, define her worth. But this was only the beginning. What happened next would spark a chain of events no one saw coming. Alana's response to Mrs. Randall's hurtful comment didn't just challenge one teacher's prejudice. It exposed a deeper issue within the school, igniting a movement that would shake the community to its core. And Alana, well, she wasn't just about to prove Mrs. Randall wrong. She was about to show the world what true courage looked like. The gym was still and quiet, as if everyone was collectively holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Alana felt the weight of so many eyes on her, some curious, some pitying, but a few shining with quiet admiration. She had no idea that her words, a courage to speak up in that moment, were planting a seed that would grow into something much bigger than herself. Denise stepped down from the bleachers, her face set in determination. Her movements were calm, but there was a fire in her eyes. She walked right up to Mrs. Randall, the silence in the room thickening with every step. "Excuse me," Denise said, her voice steady but unmistakably firm. "I'd like to have a word with you." Mrs. Randall arched an eyebrow, clearly unaccustomed to being confronted so openly. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, forcing a tight-lipped smile, "if this is about my feedback, I assure you I was simply trying to be constructive. It's important to set realistic expectations." "Realistic expectations," Denise cut in, her voice rising just enough to command attention but not veering into anger. "You're telling a 10-year-old girl, in front of her peers, that her body isn't good enough to pursue something she loves. That's not constructive. That's cruel." Alana watched her mom, a mix of relief and nervousness swelling in her chest. She had always admired how her mom could speak her mind without backing down, but part of her feared what might happen next. Mrs. Randall wasn't someone people usually challenged, especially not parents who wanted their children to stay in the program. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Mrs. Randall replied, folding her arms and glancing toward the other parents, who were now whispering among themselves. "But as the head of this program, it's my job to ensure that our dancers meet the standards of excellence we're known for. I have to be honest, even if it's difficult." Denise took a deep breath, clearly trying to rein in her frustration. "Excellence doesn't come in one shape or size," she said, "and if you think it does, then maybe you shouldn't be teaching at all." A murmur rippled through the gym, and Mrs. Randall's face tightened. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," she said, her tone clipped. But Denise wasn't having it. She turned to the other parents who were now watching with rapt attention. "How many of you have seen your kids come home doubting themselves because of comments like these?" Denise asked, her voice clear and unwavering. "How many times have they been told they're not good enough, not the right fit, not perfect enough for this program?" "It's not just about Alana. It's about all of our kids." The room buzzed with hushed conversations, and a few parents nodded subtly, their faces a mix of guilt and agreement. Some of them had seen their children struggle with self-esteem, but fear of rocking the boat had kept them silent. Until now. Alana felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside her. On one hand, she was proud of her mom for standing up for her. On the other, she felt the sting of Mrs. Randall's words lingering, whispering doubts she couldn't quite shake. She glanced down at her sneakers, the scuffs on them suddenly feeling like a symbol of all the imperfections Mrs. Randall had pointed out. As Denise and Mrs. Randall continued their tense exchange, Alana's mind wandered back to the first time she had fallen in love with dance. She was 5 years old, watching a dance performance at the community center. The dancers had seemed larger than life, their movements telling stories without a single word. She remembered tugging on her mom's sleeve and saying, "I want to do that." From that moment on, Denise had done everything she could to support Alana's dream, even when money was tight and lessons weren't cheap. But now, standing in that gym, Alana wondered if all of it had been for nothing. Was Mrs. Randall right? Did she really not belong here? As if reading her daughter's thoughts, Denise turned back to Alana and knelt down to her level. Her voice softened, but it was full of conviction. "Alana, you don't let anyone tell you who you are or what you can do," she said. "Not me, not her, not anybody, you hear me?" Alana nodded, her eyes welling up with tears she refused to let fall. "I hear you," she whispered, though part of her still wasn't sure if she believed it. What neither of them realized at that moment was how quickly the events of the day would spiral beyond the confines of the gym. By the time they got home that evening, word of the confrontation had already spread through the community. A few parents had posted vague comments on social media about what had happened, and others had shared their own stories of children being discouraged or dismissed by Mrs. Randall. Within hours, the posts had gained traction, sparking a heated debate among parents, alumni, and even former teachers. Denise sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone as notifications lit up the screen. Some of the messages were supportive, praising her for standing up for Alana and calling out what they saw as an outdated and discriminatory mindset. Others were less kind, accusing her of overreacting or trying to stir up trouble. Alana sat nearby, doodling in her sketchbook but stealing glances at her mom's phone every so often. "What are they saying?" she finally asked. Denise hesitated, not wanting to burden her daughter with the negativity. "Some people agree with us," she said carefully, "and some people don't." Alana nodded, her pencil scratching against the paper. "Do you think I should quit?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible. Denise's heart broke a little at the question. She reached across the table and placed a hand on Alana's. "You're not quitting," she said firmly. "You love to dance, and no one, especially not Mrs. Randall, gets to take that away from you." Over the next few days, the situation continued to escalate. The school administration got involved after receiving multiple complaints from parents, and a meeting was scheduled to address the growing concerns about Mrs. Randall's behavior. Alana, meanwhile, found herself at the center of attention in a way she had never experienced before. Some of her classmates rallied around her, while others seemed to distance themselves, unsure of how to navigate the sudden controversy. Even the teachers were divided. While a few privately expressed their support, others whispered about Denise being too aggressive or Alana being too sensitive. The tension at school was palpable, and Alana could feel it every time she walked down the hall. One afternoon as she was putting her books into her locker, a voice behind her said, "Hey Alana, She turned to see Mia, one of the most popular girls in her grade, standing there with a small group of friends. Mia had always been friendly in a distant, surface-level kind of way, but Alana couldn't remember the last time they had actually spoken. "I just wanted to say I thought what your mom did was really cool," Mia said, surprising Alana. "Like seriously, my cousin tried out for the dance team last year, and Mrs. Randall said something super mean to her too. She ended up quitting." Alana wasn't sure how to respond. Part of her wanted to thank Mia for her support, but another part of her felt a flicker of anger. If so many people knew about Mrs. Randall's behavior, why had no one done anything before now? "Thanks," he said finally, her voice careful. "I just want to dance, you know. I don't get why she has to make it so hard." Mia nodded, looking genuinely sympathetic. "Well, if you ever want to practice together or something, let me know," she said. "You're really good. Don't let her get to you." As Mia walked away, Alana felt a small spark of hope flicker inside her. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she thought. But the road ahead still felt uncertain, and deep down she knew the real fight was only just beginning. The days following the confrontation felt like a whirlwind for Alana and her family. The meeting with the school administrators loomed ahead, and the tension at home was hard to ignore. Denise spent hours at the dining room table, poring over articles about inclusivity in dance, jotting down notes, and drafting what she wanted to say at the meeting. Alana, meanwhile, tried to focus on her homework and pretend like things were normal. But the weight of everything was impossible to escape. At school, whispers followed her everywhere. Some kids avoided her altogether, clearly worried about being dragged into the drama. Others offered hesitant smiles or pats on the back, as if unsure how to show their support. But the worst moments came when she overheard cruel remarks in passing. "She's just causing all this for attention," one girl had said to her friend, loud enough for Alana to hear. "I heard her mom's trying to get Mrs. Randall fired." Another boy chimed in during lunch, his voice dripping with mockery. All because she didn't make the cut. Alana gritted her teeth and kept walking, her head held high even though she wanted to run and hide. It wasn't fair. None of this was. All she had done was stand up for herself, and now it felt like the world was splitting in half because of it. At home, Denise noticed the change in her daughter. Alana had always been bubbly and full of energy, but now she seemed quieter, more withdrawn. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a rerun of their favorite cooking show, Denise turned to her and asked gently, "How are you holding up, baby?" Alana shrugged, her gaze fixed on the TV. "I'm fine," she mumbled, though the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her. Denise put an arm around her and pulled her close. "It's okay to not be fine," she said softly. "You can sew strong through all of this, but you don't have to carry it alone. You know that, right?" Alana nodded but didn't say anything. She wasn't sure how to explain the knot of emotions inside her: anger, sadness, embarrassment, and something else she couldn't quite name. All she knew was that she felt tired. Tired of being talked about. Tired of having to prove herself. Tired of the way Mrs. Randall's words seemed to echo in her head, no matter how hard she tried to forget them. As the days went on, Denise began to notice something else. Alana wasn't practicing her dancing anymore. The music that usually filled their living room every afternoon was gone, replaced by an unsettling quiet. It was like a piece of her daughter's spirit had been snuffed out, and it broke Denise's heart. One night, she decided to talk to Alana about it. "I haven't seen you practicing lately," she said, trying to sound casual as they cleared the dinner table. "Everything okay?" Alana hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of a plate. "I don't know if I want to anymore," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Denise set down the dish she was holding and turned to her daughter. "What do you mean? You love to dance." "I thought I did," Alana said, her shoulders slumping. "But what's the point if people are just going to make fun of me? Or say I'm not good enough?" Denise knelt down so she was eye level with her daughter. "Alana, listen to me. Dancing isn't about what anyone else thinks. It's about what makes you happy. Does dancing make you happy?" Alana looked down at her feet, her voice small as she said, "It used to." Denise reached out and took her daughter's hands in hers. "Then don't let anyone take that away from you. Not Mrs. Randall, not those kids at school, not anyone. You are enough just as you are. And if you love something, you fight for it." Alana's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll try." While Alana wrestled with her doubts, things were heating up in the broader community. The upcoming school board meeting had become the talk of the town, with parents and teachers taking sides. Some defended Mrs. Randall, insisting that she was just doing her job and that the backlash was overblown. Others argued that her behavior was part of a larger problem, one that had gone unchecked for far too long. Denise found herself at the center of the storm, fielding calls and messages from other parents almost daily. Some thanked her for speaking out, sharing their own stories of how their children had been affected by Mrs. Randall's rigid standards. Others accused her of blowing things out of proportion, warning her that she was putting Alana in an even more difficult position. One evening, Denise received a particularly heated email from a parent who had always been close to Mrs. Randall. The message accused her of trying to tear down a beloved teacher and warned her to think about the consequences of stirring up so much trouble. Denise read the email twice, her hands shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. She closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on her. But she refused to back down. She knew what was at stake, not just for Alana, but for every child who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. This wasn't just about one comment or one teacher. It was about creating a culture where all kids felt valued and supported, no matter what they looked like or how they moved. The night of the school board meeting arrived, and the auditorium was packed. Parents, students, and teachers filled the seats, their faces a mix of anticipation and tension. Alana sat in the front row with her mom, her stomach twisting in knots. She had never been in a room so full of energy before, and it was both exhilarating and terrifying. As the meeting began, various parents and community members took turns speaking at the podium. Some defended Mrs. Randall, praising her for her years of dedication to the program and insisting that her comments had been misunderstood. Others, including a few former students, shared stories of how her rigid expectations had left them feeling crushed and inadequate. When it was Denise's turn to speak, she walked to the podium with a calm confidence that made Alana sit up a little straighter. Denise took a deep breath and began, her voice clear and steady. "I'm here tonight as a parent, but also as an advocate for every child in this community," she said. "Our kids deserve to be supported, encouraged, and celebrated for who they are, not judged against arbitrary standards that do more harm than good." When my daughter stood up for herself, she wasn't just defending her own dreams. She was standing up for every child who has ever been told they're not enough. As Denise continued, Alana felt a swell of pride in her chest. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. But as she looked across the room, she saw Mrs. Randall sitting with her arms crossed, her face a mask of indifference. And Alana knew the fight was far from over.